Forms. Forms are how the user can access or give data to the server. Forms generally contain text boxes, password input, drop-down menus, large text areas, radio buttons, checkbox, buttons, labels, and everything more. Now today we're going to cover all of these. Unfortunately, until we learn how to manage this data using the backend language called PHP, which we will eventually tackle, forms aren't super useful. Nevertheless, it is important to know because when we get to PHP, we absolutely need to know how to create a form. Now the first part of the form that we're going to learn about are the text boxes. You've probably logged into Facebook, Gmail, YouTube, or some other type of website. The little box where you type in your email or your username, that is a text box. Put your email, you can put your name, and this is how we code one of these. We use the input tag, the type is text, because it's a text box, and we name it. Now it's a great practice to always name every one of your inputs. Now you've probably also noticed that it doesn't have a closing tag. That's because what we put in here is actually the value attribute that we are changing. So the input is an open and close tag together. Now the input element, I would say, is pretty unique, and this is just because if you change the type, you can change it to just about anything. We're going to cover the password input next, but to change this to a password field so it doesn't show up with any of the text, you just change the type to password. Oh, and the reason that we want to name everything is because once we get into the PHP side of things and you already have the habit formed of naming everything, it will be that much easier for you to manage and handle the information that the user is sending to you through a form. Next, let's look at the password input. Password input is very similar to text boxes, so let's take a look below. So we have the input type, we just changed it from text to password, and again we named it, we just called it user pass. When I type in here, what I typed in there was the word password, but you can't tell. Now obviously this is for security reasons, and even if I tried to copy it out of there, that sound says I'm not allowed to copy it. Sometimes you want to give the user a choice, and they have to choose an option. To do this, we use the select element. We open it and we close it like a regular tag, we named it, and this is very similar to our list. So we open our list, an unordered list, list items, and we closed it. Now in this case, we use select, option, another option, and then we close our select. What we have up here is we have a value. These aren't too important right now. You notice when I select this that it is actually grayed out a little bit and I'm unable to click it. Cannot click it. That's because I have disabled is equal to disabled, which means I'm not allowed to click it. But the reason that it's selected is because I have it selected. But once I click another one, for example, I just clicked male, I cannot click select gender again. I have to choose between male or female. And just like our lists from earlier, we can have as many options as we like. The only thing that's going to limit you to your options is your time. Now let's cover text areas. If you want a larger text field than that from above, we can use the text area element. And we use it like so. We open our element with text area, named it. We add rows and columns, otherwise it's going to be pretty short, typically only 2 or 3 rows. One row is one line right across. So this, for example, would be one row. And we added 60 columns. And I do believe that one column is one letter across. And here we have our content. And that's where we put our add a biography. And we close our tag. And the reason this isn't like every other input element, for example a text box element, is because we actually put the content in here. When we add content in here, the browser will automatically put it into the text box area. Radio buttons. They're very similar to the select element. We can give the user radio buttons, and they can usually only select one option. For example, if I click 1, 2, or 3, I'm only allowed to click one of them at a time. Now, the trick to this is that all 3 radio buttons have the same name. And again, name is important. So here's the code that we're going to look at. We have number 1, just right up here. number 2, and the third radio button. All three have the same name. It's called radio. The value is different. That's not important. The ID is different. That's not important. What's important is that the type and the name are the same. What I mean is type, all three have to be radio, and the name, all three have to be radio. Now you can change the name to anything you like. It doesn't have to be radio. It could be your name. It could be the name of a pet. It could be a number or a letter. That's not really too important. What is important is that all three names match up and they're the exact same. The reason it's important to have all names the same is because if you don't, you'll be able to choose more than one of these. And the thing with the radio button is once it's clicked, you cannot unclick it. You have to select another option. So as you see, I'm trying to click number 1 here, trying to unclick it, and it's just not working. I have to select number 2 or 3 to uncheck number 1. The checkboxes are like radio buttons in code, but in functionality they're pretty different. With a radio button, you should only be able to select one option. With a checkbox, you can check off as many as you want. Now taking a look at the code, our type is equal to checkbox, and all three names are the same. But I'm able to check off and select different ones here. Now you may have noticed that our second checkbox has an attribute called checked with a value of checked. That means when the page loads, that this second checkbox will automatically be checked, and it is up to the user to uncheck it. Now let's cover buttons. When it comes to forms, we have two different button elements. We can use the actual button element, or we can use the input, and the type is equal to button. Now in both cases, in either the button or the input, we can change the button type to either keep it a button, to submit the form, or to reset it. First we'll cover the button. So you notice with a button, it has a closing tag. That's because everything inside of the two tags is what's going to be displayed. Now that's the exact same as the input for the value attribute. Now either way you do it, if you prefer to use a button or an input, it doesn't really matter. They both do the exact same thing, to be honest with you. It's just two different ways of doing it. Now when I click them, nothing is going to happen. And nothing is supposed to happen. It's not supposed to have any functionality until we give it something to do. Typically this is done with JavaScript or an event handler, or sometimes it's even wrapped in an anchor element, which is your link, and the button is styled differently. And this way it looks like your button is actually a link. Now let's look at the reset button. It's the same thing from above, only the type is equal to reset. We change the value, so the button outputs different text. But again, when we click it, nothing is going to happen. It still looks the same, and it acts the same as button. This is true. However, if we put the reset button inside a form element and then we click it, it will clear all of our information back to default. Unfortunately, this isn't used too often anymore, but it still can be a very handy tool to use for your user. Finally, let's look at the submit button. Same thing, we can use button or input, change the type to submit. All I did was change the value. Or I guess I changed the value of the input, and I changed the content from the button. They still look the same. When I click them, nothing is going to happen. And again, nothing will happen with any of these until we insert them inside the form element. Once the submit button is clicked inside the form element, the form will be submitted to the server, and it will be submitted to where we decide to send it. Now we've been talking about forms, and we haven't actually covered the form element yet. But we do know so far that all the elements from above are actually quite useless unless we put them inside a form. Now here's what it looks like. We open it, we close it. The form has a method attribute and an action attribute. With a method attribute, we can change this to post or get. We're not going to cover this right now, it's not too important until we actually get into data handling. But the action attribute is what's important right now. So when we click submit, it's going to bring us to this page here. Furthermore, if we look at the code, we have an input section, the type is text, so that's going to be our text box, and we named it name. We have another input, its type is submit, it's right here, and that's going to submit our form. Then we have one more input, type is equal to reset, and when we click it, it's going to reset our form. So here's a working example. I'm just going to type my name in here, Caleb Tallene. When I click reset, it empties it. I put it in again, and it empties it. So the reset button inside the form element will in fact reset your entire form. Now let's see what happens when we click the submit button. Just going to type my name once again, and it brought us to the page that we specified. We told it to go to mypage.html, and it did. It brought us to mypage.html. Now we didn't keep the information that we put into the text field, but for now that's okay. Right now I just wanted to cover what a form is and a couple of the different elements that it has and how we can use them. Once we get into PHP, this is going to be an extremely important part of data handling. This is how you create a registration form or a login system, but that is way down the road. We have to get through the front end first, so our HTML, CSS. We're also going to go through JavaScript and jQuery, and then we can tackle the back end, which is the PHP.